Welcome everyone to this session, which is entitled Canada and the Arctic, Climate Change and Security. My name is Paul Stevers and I'm the conference chair. Dr. Max Margulies is going to be the moderator for this session. He is an assistant professor of international affairs and director of the Rupert H. Johnson Grand Strategy Program at West Point. His current projects aim to understand the relationship between military organizational policies, especially conscription, and politics beyond the battlefield. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in political science from Columbia, and a BA in political science from McGill. So, Max, you're on.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. I'm really happy to do this, so thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. My plan is to say very little so that the light can be on the presenters. But as a reminder, anything I do say are just my personal views and not the views of the United States Military Academy, Department of Defense, or US government. Though Arctic security isn't really my field, I am particularly happy to have an opportunity to moderate a panel on Canada and the Arctic. I am a McGill alumnus, and I desperately wish that I had paid more attention to Canadian politics and security issues while I was there, especially since I ended up marrying a Canadian who I met there. So Canada definitely has a special place in my heart, and as I've moved on to my new role as Director of Research at the Modern War Institute at West Point, I'm very much thinking about issues relating to Arctic cooperation and Arctic security. So on a professional note, it has been really great to see climate issues taking on an increasing role in academic conversations about international security. When I was an instructor for the Intro to International Relations class that all cadets have to take at West Point, we added a specific lesson on climate change, and saw a lot of cadets choosing to address climate change as a challenge in their final essay prompts. Now at the Modern War Institute, I've had the pleasure of working with people on our new Arctic security project, Project 6633. So this is certainly a very timely and much needed topic that we will be discussing today. Without any further ado, then I will turn it over to our three excellent speakers, starting with the Honorable John Conger, who is currently the Director of the Center for Climate and Security. Previously, he was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller at the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as he also has experience as an Assistant Secretary, Acting Deputy Undersecretary, and Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment. So quite the background in public service. Mr. Conger, over to you.
Thanks so much. So for this session, my plan is to talk about the report we wrote, Climate Security Plan for Canada. For those of you who have been watching multiple of these sessions, earlier on today, you heard me talk about the Center for Climate and Security, where I'm currently the director, and a report we put out called the Climate Security Plan for America. And it had a bunch of recommendations for the Biden administration. We had published that in 2019. Well, in the wake of that report, we were funded by the Canadian Department of National Defense through their Mines grant program to develop a similar plan from a Canadian perspective. Now, before I get into the details of that, it's important to recognize that while climate change is a global issue, and there are, what we do or what anybody does affects the entire globe in some way as carbon increases in the atmosphere and so on. Every nation is going to look at the problem differently. Every nation has its own geography. Every nation has its own security strategy, its own climate strategy, and its own military footprint, and so on and so forth. So when you look at the same thing through a different set of glasses, you get a different set of results. So we sat down and said, all right, from a Canadian perspective, what does this climate security problem look like? So first thing we did was we looked at the Canadian climate policy, which is very mature and very robust. Unlike, frankly, the United States, the domestic policy on climate change and emissions reductions was very mature. The security strategy, however, had a lot, while it had a lot of mentions of climate change, the responses proposed weren't necessarily directly applicable to the problems presented. So we sort of explored that in a little bit more detail. And I'll make one other sort of upfront point, which is that in the United States, where climate security is a topic that we talk about quite a bit, it in many ways was the only or one of the main issues we could get broad consensus on, political consensus, and so that it has moved farther along than some climate policy has. Whereas in Canada, they didn't need to start with climate security in order to get consensus. There was a broad policy consensus on emissions reductions from the start. And so the security policy didn't get pushed ahead quite as much and have quite as much emphasis. So when we unpacked the problem set, we sort of looked at the National Defense Strategy, Strong, Secure, Engaged, and thought, okay, this is a good framework to use for analyzing climate security, not just security. So the Canadian National Security Strategy has sort of three sections in its vision. It's strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world. And when you look at the strong at home portion of the problem set, they are looking at, okay, how does it affect the Canadian homeland? How does it affect Canadian citizens? What are the human security risks there? And frankly, the sort of military footprint as well. So we unpacked that, and you can see that there are many of the same impacts in Canada as there are in the US. The bases are, might on the coast might be threatened by sea level rise. There's certainly flooding and wildfires that you have to be paid attention to. And in particular, because Canada has a slightly smaller military than the United States, it is more stressing when they have to respond to national disasters. It has a sort of a greater impact on overall readiness. And that's something that we noted in our analysis, that there may very well be a need to sort of analyze what that additional requirement would be to respond if the military is going to be responding to natural disasters driven by climate change, what that requirement would be, and whether the military would need to grow in order to respond to that, or some civilian capacity needed to be increased in order to respond. So when we're thinking through strong at home, the other piece of this that I think is really important to recognize is that there is a significant indigenous population up in the Arctic that is being affected by climate change. And so their sort of livelihood, personal security is impacted. And as we all know, national security starts with the human security of our civilians and our citizens. So that has to be part of the picture. As we sort of looked broadly to the continental perspective, if you look at the strong, secure, engaged, and you look at the Canadian defense strategy, the second part of it deals a lot with partnership with the United States, NORAD, the North Warning System, and so on and so forth. But very much all through the document, the strategy document, it talks about partnership with the United States. And this leads me to another conclusion, which is that Canada, in their posture, in the sort of their partnerships, has to deal with a nation that is sometimes schizophrenic that the United States doesn't have to deal with, which is the United States. And so whereas the US policy and posture swings back and forth, Canada has to negotiate that and navigate that policy. So when we're dealing with climate change, that's part of that story too. One of the things that's more stable in the United States, however, from a climate policy perspective, is the security policy. And so one of the opportunities that Canada has is to emphasize the security element of its climate policy, if only because in that partnership with the United States, that is one of the more stable places to talk about climate change. It's consistent through administrations. And while there may be increased emphasis in different administrations, certainly even during the Trump administration, the Department of Defense in the United States was paying attention to resilience, to Arctic strategy, to those pieces of the national security strategy that are impacted by climate change. Then So as we move past that to engage in the world, which is the third element of the Canadian security strategy, it's hard to look at the world and the overall stability situation without incorporating climate change. Certainly, climate stress is impacting the stability of developing nations in many parts of the world. The fact that the Arctic is opening up is directly, a consequence of climate change, and so that's impacting relationships with major powers in the region. And so that's obviously something Canada has to pay attention to as both a domestic issue, because frankly, Canada has more at stake in the Arctic than almost any other nation, perhaps Russia being the one exception. I think they have a larger land area in the Arctic, or maybe not land area. I'm going to get in trouble if I start citing comparing too much. But the point is that there's a lot at stake there. It's a big emphasis. And we talk a lot about how the U.S. is hamstrung by the fact that it has maybe one icebreaker available to it, 1.5 when people are being generous. Canada has many more. And so they have a capacity in the Arctic that exceeds the United States in some respects. So all of those dynamics are important. Let's talk a little bit before we run out of time about recommendations. We recommended that Canada develop a holistic Canadian climate security plan, something that went across agencies, Global Affairs Canada, CSIS, the Department of National Defense, to work together in that context, to look at how individual systems and readiness and infrastructure are impacted by climate change, to look at how missions are going to be affected by climate change and what force structure changes might need to be made. What new missions might be created as the Arctic thaws, as the permafrost thaws, as it becomes more accessible. How is that going to change surveillance requirements, for example, and what new investments need to be made? As we think about adapting to climate change, so you go beyond study into actually sort of investing in resilience and making sure that you have the right force structure at the right place at the right time, thinking about it in that context. As Canada engages in the world, increasing the emphasis on climate change in security fora is really important, whether that's the United Nations or NATO. I know that there's a big NATO meeting coming up, and I understand Canada is going to be talking about climate change in that forum. I think that's important. That this is a place where Canada has a lot to talk about from a slightly different perspective than other countries, and I think that that's a really vital role to play. One thing I did want to sort of close with is a conversation about emissions. If you look at the Canadian security strategy, the response to climate change that's articulated is focused on emissions, but let's be clear, the security problems driven by climate change, the answer is not necessarily emissions reductions. That's a long-term fix for long-term problems, but if we all went to zero emissions tomorrow, we're still going to have 10, 20, 30 years of security problems that we're going to have to deal with. That's the US and Canada and everybody else in the world. So planning for those impacts is got to be the first thing that's dealt with in this context. Emissions reductions are important. They're part of the puzzle, but they're not necessarily the direct response to the security challenges that are going to be imposed on Canada by climate change. So anyway, thank you very much. I'll look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. What a great holistic overview of issues for adapting to climate change for both Canada and its partners. Before I turn it over to our next speaker, I do want to just remind everybody that if you do have questions, you can type them out in the chat, and we have people who will forward them on to us. So with that, our next speaker will be Peter Hammerschmidt, who was appointed the Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy for the Canadian government in December 2017. Prior to assuming his current duties, he was Director General for Policy Coordination at National Defense, Director General for national cybersecurity at Public Safety and executive assistant to the clerk of the Privy Council. And he has had a lengthy career in public service. So we're really looking forward to hearing his comments on Canada and the Arctic. Thank you.
Sorry, no audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So thank you, Max, and hi, John, and hi, Heather. Very happy to be here today to share some insights into our observations about climate change and climate security in particular, as it pertains and as it challenges us in the Arctic. The Arctic, obviously, for Canada, goes without saying, it's a huge part of our country. It's a massive part of our territory, about 40%. It's a big part of our heritage, our identity, and also of our big part of our future as a country. I think we need to be thinking about the Arctic on a long-term basis, and I mean like a really long-term, and we need to be doing that with our climate lens on. You know, for all the challenges that climate change is going to present to us and other countries around the world, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity as well. Canada, in fact, you know, Canada and other northern nations might be seeing some unparalleled opportunity as some of these northern regions open up, and as the Arctic opens up and it becomes more temperate. I think, you know, 50, 60 years from now, Canada may very well be in a bit of a climate sweet spot for humans. More arable land, more accessible resources, more open Arctic transportation routes. All of that is going to make us one of the most attractive places on the planet when it comes to resources, climate, and migration as people move as a result of climate change. So we stand, as a country, we stand to gain enormously over the course of the coming decades. But we can only really take advantage of that and exploit that opportunity if we are in a position to protect the North and to protect our Arctic. Food insecurity, scarcer natural resources, and climate migration are all going to mean that countries are going to be looking at our North increasingly in the coming decades. So we need to be prepared for that. We need to be thinking about the kind of investments we want to make, and we need to be working closer with our allies in the North to ensure that our collective interests in the Arctic are well protected. But from the defense perspective, there's a number of different dynamics that we're watching in the Arctic and planning for. Fundamentally, we really see the Arctic as being a bit of an inflection point where you've got economic interests and geopolitical competition and climate change all converging, coming together in a way that's making that region much, much more strategically important than it was in the past. Now, from the strategic competition point of view, a more accessible Arctic fundamentally means more international interest and more activity in the region. Again, the opening of the Arctic presents opportunities. And so Arctic and non-Arctic nations alike are already starting to prepare themselves to exploit those opportunities. It really is one of the last relatively untapped domains on Earth when it comes to natural resources. And with more open transportation routes, the Arctic is becoming critical from a strategic geography perspective as well. So we're already starting to see the posturing and positioning play out. Competitors are demonstrating more assertive posture and are using advanced military and dual use capabilities to operate in the Arctic. They're also stepping up their use of non-military tools to advance their interests in the region, you know, whether that's economic tools or disinformation or otherwise. Russia, of course, maintains the largest military presence in the Arctic, and they continue to invest heavily in infrastructure, in advanced capabilities, and in major military exercises as well. And China, as a self-declared near-Arctic state, has become increasingly involved in Arctic affairs and trade, and are clearly seeking to establish a foothold in the region. They've made their ambitions, whether it's geostrategic or economic or otherwise, they've made those ambitions very clear in their own Arctic white paper. So in addition to reshaping the strategic environment that we're working in, climate change is also going to present some immediate as well as long-term challenges to defense from an operational point of view. Climate change is rapidly transforming the Arctic and the northern landscape. It's warming at a rate 3 times that of the global average. Permafrost degradation is accelerating, coastal erosion is accelerating, and all the infrastructure and livelihoods that are in the Arctic are also being affected by this. Climate change is also compromising, of course, defense infrastructure in the Arctic, the infrastructure that we use that is so essential for our Canadian Forces' ability to be mobile up in the Arctic, to operate out of the region. And also it's affecting the infrastructure that NORAD relies on for its capabilities for conflict. More broadly, and not just in the Arctic, the increase in the frequency as well as the severity of natural disasters and extreme weather events is already imposing additional demands on the military to support domestic emergency response as well as search and rescue operations all around the country, but including in the north. And then globally, we're seeing climate change exacerbate all the regional tensions and vulnerabilities that already exist. And so we can anticipate increased demands for the Canadian Forces to contribute to peace and stability overseas in the So the challenge for defense really is about how best do we meet all these growing demands without undermining our missions. Now, to meet the strategic threat, Canada has committed to working with the United States to defend North America through the modernization of NORAD, as well as broader domestic and continental defense capability enhancements. A lot of this work, of course, will be concentrated in the Arctic, just due to the geography of it all, and as well on our Arctic capabilities. NORAD modernization in particular, which will include the replacement of the surveillance capabilities that are currently carried out by the North Warning System, is really at the core of this work. As a top priority, what we're working on now is to develop what we call a system of systems that would provide all domain awareness to the defense of Canada and North America. This begins with a network of sensors that would be put into place across all domains from underwater up to space. And although this certainly isn't just an Arctic problem, improving our ability to see what is happening in the north, as well as what is happening in the approaches to our north, is going to be critically important, as is having the ability, of course, to respond and to defeat any developments of concern in those areas. So that's going to be pretty key to restoring the deterrence that our northern geography has traditionally provided. We're also going to need to make some pretty significant investments in our Arctic infrastructure and sustainment. We're going to need to modernize it and adapt it to future operational demands, as well as the projected impact of climate change on this infrastructure. I would add as well that in all of this, in all the investments we're looking to make in the north, there's going to be a huge opportunity here to invest in dual-use infrastructure that not only helps defend Canada, but also supports the local priorities of northerners and northern communities, including in areas like climate change. Now, to address the climate challenge within defense, we are working to integrate climate security issues into all of our activities, whether it's policy planning, research and development, procurement, infrastructure and operations, and so on. So for example, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they're all conducting reviews right now of the impact of climate change on their activities. The results of these reviews are going to inform future planning around operations, training requirements, force structure, and so on. We're also developing a climate change adaptation risk assessment framework to help assess all defense programs and critical infrastructure. We are, of course, the largest user of energy and the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the federal government. So defense has a pretty key role to play when it comes to helping the government of Canada meet its environmental sustainability targets. The bottom line is that if defense doesn't succeed, then the government can't succeed. That's how big our share is. So we're doing a lot of work in a number of different areas to address this. We're looking at decarbonizing some of our operational fleets, looking to explore further clean energy procurement than we're doing right now. And we've adopted an aggressive approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our commercial light-duty vehicle fleet. That and a number of other initiatives are underway to try to reduce overall. We're also reaching out to experts and academics and learn more about what we can do. So John mentioned the excellent report that his organization did for us and for the Mines program. Thank you, John, for the shout out. That has been very illuminating in terms of informing some of the things that we need to do within the defense fold. But John, you'll be happy to know that I've also taken that report and used it as an opportunity to advance the conversation in the broader national security community here in Canada, to get at the recommendation that was in the report around building a more comprehensive, more cohesive national level plan on climate and security. So very, very useful to engage with John and other organizations as we try to work our way through this difficult challenge. Last thing I'll mention quickly, we We are, of course, working very closely with allies and partners. This is fundamental to how we operate in the world, and it's no different here at home and no different on the question of climate. So it'll continue to define how we operate in the Arctic. Learning from others is going to be a key way of mitigating the challenges that we're going to be facing. The US is Canada's premier schizophrenic and wonderful partner, I would add, in the region. Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden recently committed to a roadmap expanding cooperation on continental defense and Arctic security. And the US, of course, has made some considerable strides in this area, so lots to learn from them. We're cooperating as well deeply with Norway and Denmark and other Arctic states to expand our ability to see what's happening in the broader Arctic region. We're inviting Arctic allies to participate in northern operations here in Canada, and we're working on a lot of multilateral R&D with allies as well in this space. And lastly, NATO, of course, key partner here. NATO will be moving forward with a more comprehensive climate and security agenda, and Canada intends. So I'll stop there. I think I'm late on time there, so stop. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much for your comments. I think it's really interesting and valuable to think about climate change as presenting both opportunities and challenges. And of course, it's always great to hear so much focus on partnership. I'm also very glad to see that many of you have already started to share questions. So I will hand it over to our next speaker so we can, after which we'll move on to the Q&A session. So our final speaker for this panel will be Heather Conley. She is the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She was previously Executive Director of the Office of the Chairman of the Board at the American National Red Cross and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. So we are very fortunate to have her taking us home today on this panel. Heather, over to you.
Max, thank you so much. It's great to be with John and Peter. As we like to say, we're the other CSIS. That's our joke at CSIS, but we're speaking to a Canadian colleague. So thank you so much. I've been asked to talk about Russia's Arctic strategy, something that we've been studying at CSIS really for the last 12 years. And I'll go through it very briefly so we can get to your questions. We look forward to the conversation. In fact, although amidst of the pandemic, it may have been lost, Russia released two very important documents last year. The first document in March, again, as the pandemic was beginning to unfold, and I think it certainly got lost in some of the headlines. And this law was the basic principles of the Russian Federation's policy in the Arctic until 2035. And then they released a second document in October of last year called the Strategy for Development and National Security for the Arctic, again, to 2035. So two very important blueprints. Now, I think it's important to highlight that when Russia is talking about national security in the Arctic, I mean, of course, for an American, a Canadian audience, when we think of national security and Russia's posture in the Arctic, we, of course, think of their increased military posture, their nuclear submarine modernization, their new exotic weaponry, whether that's hypersonic cruise missiles or unmanned undersea nuclear-tipped drones. But when Russia talks about national security in the Arctic, they're talking about something completely different. They're talking about depopulation in the region. They're talking about inadequate environmental monitoring, underdeveloped infrastructure, poor quality of life. Again, it's important to note that there's two very different Arctics. The North American Arctic is sparsely populated with very limited infrastructure. The European and Eurasian Arctic is completely different. Russia's Arctic is home to 2 million people with extensive infrastructure. So it is a very different sense of Arctic. But when Russia talks about its national security in the Arctic, it's really talking about its own internal development. And it really does understand that climate is dramatically transforming Russia, and we'll talk a bit about permafrost thaw, but in some ways it will be the most impacted amongst the Arctic states. for climate change. So again, 2020 was not only an impactful year for the globe with the pandemic, it was an exceptionally impactful year for Russia. 2020 was the hottest year on record. The wildfires, the area of destruction by wildfires was the equivalent to the size of Greece, emitting more than 1/3 of Russia's carbon emissions just from the wildfires alone. We are seeing, again, 2/3 of Russia's territory is within permafrost thaw. And we saw literally the destruction and capabilities of what permafrost thaw does to infrastructure, with the 21,000 tons of diesel fuel spilled in the Norilsk area, a very fragile river system. And that was because a storage tank collapsed because of permafrost thaw. So the potential, of course, of the ticking time bomb of permafrost thaw is real. You know, in 3 decades, we could see an extraordinary release of carbon and methane simply because of the permafrost thaw in Russia, destruction of the boreal forests. So, I mean, there is a tremendous impact of climate change in Russia. I think it's also important to note that not only is Russia the 4th largest carbon emitter in the world, per capita, it is the highest emitter in the world, far exceeding China, again, because of the population disparity. So we really do have an extraordinary challenge when it comes to thinking about Russia and climate change. Now, of course, when you listen to Russian government officials, they are explaining the benefits of climate change, the opening of transshipment routes, the Northern Sea Route, the additional exploration of oil and gas resources, mineral resources, even the fisheries potential. So it is described as benefit, but there is now increasing acknowledgement of the growing risks. Russian government officials have calculated that climate may cost the Russian GDP 3% annually in the future. They are understanding now, I think, more fully the costs as well as the opportunities. This, of course, is an important month because as leaders gather in Reykjavik this week for the Arctic Council Ministerial, the baton passes from Iceland, that held the 2-year chairmanship, to Russia. So this is really an opportunity for Russia in its 2-year Arctic Council chairmanship to highlight the sustainable development that is written in many of its strategies. And certainly the Russian government is embracing the language of climate change. It is embracing the symmetry of climate change, but unfortunately its actions are working absolutely in the opposite direction of those words. It is increasing fossil fuel production. It is really in many ways doubling down on its strategy of fossil fuels. It is very far behind in any sense of renewable strategy, very nascent progress on blue or green hydrogen. So while again, embracing the language of climate, embracing that, particularly for the Arctic, its actions undercut those words. But in many respects, change is coming to Russia, but it's probably coming more externally than internally driven. If the European Union embraces a carbon border adjustment mechanism, this will profoundly change the Russian economy based on again, fossil fuel exportation, the ESG movement, financing. So change is coming to Russia's economic model because of global climate demand and carbon neutrality if they are achieved. But this will be incredibly painful to the Russian economy. So there are changes that are certainly coming. We can also discuss in the Q&A Russia's military footprint in the Arctic, which is growing in part because its economic ambitions demand greater domain awareness. Just as Peter was mentioning, that's what's important for Canada. Greater accessibility means they need to know who and what is operating in their Arctic. But certainly we see a concentration of Russia's military footprint in its Western Arctic around the Kola Peninsula, its expansion of military bases in Franz Josef Land, which do present challenges to certainly to Russia, to NATO, to the United States, and we do need to increase those avenues of approach to the North America, certainly whether that's in the air or in the sea. So lots of challenges, but I turn this back over to you, Max, for the questions. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Heather. Great to hear about the perspective of a different country, but an important one. Which actually brings me to what I think I'd like to ask for the first question that we got, which is very much up maybe our background with in international relations theory. But having just heard about Russia in the Arctic, one audience member has asked about, with greater interest from non-Arctic states, particularly China, attempting to gain influence on the Arctic Council, what are the prospects for collaboration with non-Arctic states, maybe especially with Asia-Pacific countries, to strengthen the international rules-based order? I think, Heather, I see you nodding already, so I'll give you a first crack at it, and then this question is for everyone, so we can see if John or Peter have thoughts.
Well, thank you, Max. It's a great question, and there is tension, because while the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea gives the 5 Arctic coastal states an abundance of governance, there has been a lot of innovation in addressing many of the challenges of the Arctic: search and rescue, oil spill response, science and research. But the Arctic is not simply for the region. The impact of climate in the Arctic affects globally. So we've had a lot of states wanting to become permanent observers to the Arctic Council, again, an intergovernmental forum. So it's consensus-based. There's no enforcement mechanisms to join as observers. So China, Japan, India, more and more countries. In fact, Estonia and Ireland want to join, and that will be under consideration in this week's ministerial. So is it regional? Is it global? It's both. And this is an important governance challenge. Now, I will say, when China became a permanent observer in 2013, I think that was an inflection point for the Arctic Council, because now there are 20 plus permanent observers. There's also organizations. You can't even fit these meetings in the North anymore. They're so big because of the number of participants. So there is a challenge of how to manage this. But I would say for China, what's so critical, and Peter mentioned this, it's transparency. We welcome scientific collaboration. We welcome economic, sustainable investment if the local community desires it, if the national government approves it. But there is not always transparency with some of these activities, investments, and that's where the Arctic states really need to hold non-Arctic states to the highest standard of transparency and accountability of their activities in the Arctic.
Great, thank you. John or Peter, does either of you want to? Yeah, Peter, we'll go over to you next. Thanks.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, it's a great question. The Arctic actually is one area that has had the benefit of a lot of practical cooperation between nations between the Arctic nations. Of course, over time, as Heather alluded to, a lot of other countries too have also looked to get involved in things like the Arctic Council, a lot of non-Arctic states. But all of that is kind of building on a history and a tradition of collaboration and cooperation in a region that has been peaceful and that has been managed through the international rules-based order. So, there's still plenty of room and plenty of optimism for continued collaboration in the Arctic, but among Arctic and non-Arctic partners alike. There's plenty to build on, like search and rescue cooperation, Coast Guard cooperation, socioeconomic and environmental cooperation. So I think plenty of opportunity there. Arctic Council is not a security forum. Arctic Council deals with non-security issues. So when it comes to the question of security cooperation in the Arctic, that's a bit of a different bowl of fish. and a more problematic one, given that Russia was, there were some burgeoning, engagement with Russia before their illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Since that point in time, cooperation with Russia on security matters has been under a chill, pardon the pun. So it's a bit of a different game when it comes to security, but in many other areas, there's a proven track record of cooperation among Arctic and non-Arctic states.
Can I just add one point? So I think it's important to recognize that where cooperation has been in the past, it's not necessarily a guarantee that there will be cooperation in the future. When you're talking about a moderately inaccessible area, it's a lot easier for folks to say that they'd be happy to cooperate. But as more and more, as there is more at stake and more opportunity for different nations and they see more gain, that cooperative attitude will have an edge to it. And I think that's just important to keep in mind. There's, in a different part of the world, we often talk about how disputes over rivers and water has been one of the best areas for long-term cooperation in the world. But as fresh water becomes more and more scarce, and people decide they want to build dams, that cooperation could turn to tension as well. So just to say, the history of cooperation is not necessarily a guarantee of future cooperation, and it's going to take a lot of hard work.
Great, thank you. We only have around 2 minutes left before we have to sign off, so I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question and just ask for very brief comments. Because one audience member asked a very interesting question about, is there a role for the Inuit to play in transmitting traditional knowledge to the Canadian Armed Forces? What kind of opportunities are there? Peter, I know you're in a particular rush, but do you have a few seconds?
Yeah, thanks for accommodating. I got to rush it to brief the minister. The Inuit absolutely do have a role to play and have been playing a pretty active role in the context of the development of the Arctic Northern Policy Framework that was launched a year or two ago here in Canada. The Arctic Northern Policy Framework is meant to be a vision for the North that touches on 8 broad thematic areas, including defense and security. And even though defense and security are almost exclusively a federal jurisdiction, we open up that entire process on defense and security, but all the other themes as well, in what we call a co-development policy process. And key stakeholders from right across the North were represented in that process, fully engaged, including the Inuit. And it has produced not just a very comprehensive and excellent vision for the North, but one that has baked into it buy-in from the stakeholders that contributed to it. So a very successful model for how policy development and the implementation of programs can be done in the northern regions.
Great. Thank you. Heather, John?
I'll just throw in that security for the Inuit is part of Canadian national security. It is not 2 separate things. And so as Canadian national security strategy is developed and as Arctic strategy is developed, it is important to weave in the security for the Inuit as part of that, and they can contribute back to the greater national security strategy opportunities. There are going to be observations they're going to be able to make. There's going to be infrastructure that they're going to be able to receive. There's a two-way street, and all should benefit.
I love thinking about human security as part of national security like that. Thank you. Heather, last word.
I was just going to say one of the most unique elements of the Arctic Council is that the permanent participants, the Indigenous communities, sit at that table. So we never forget the individual is at the center of the work that the council does. But a note of caution, the Indigenous communities are also maybe vulnerable to outside states, non-state actors that also may take advantage of the opportunity, which is why we need their eyes and ears, their traditional knowledge to understand the changes, but they are also part of a strong national defense. They are part of our all domain awareness. In fact, their awareness is really the linchpin of our success. So play an absolutely key role.
Fantastic comments, really gets me thinking. a lot to think about there, but we are unfortunately out of time. So I want to just thank Peter, Heather, John, Paul as well, and the entire tech support team. Thank you all for, thank you to our panelists for joining us, and thank you to everyone else for making this possible. I hope everybody will stay tuned for the Strategies to Mitigate Conflict panel, which is coming up right now at 1:30 Eastern. The link should be in the chat. So thanks, everyone.